Thank you, Austin. It's a pleasure to be with everyone again today. And it's been a while since I've been on one of these clinics, and I intend to be on a lot more. We're continuing to conduct research, continuing to learn, and today we're going to talk about something that is very original in terms of our previous presentations, and we're going to be discussing content that really isn't anywhere else except in the UF program that's referenced on the slide beside me. What I'd like to do is move right into the content, and I'm going to do so in the classic way that marketing experience has been approaching such sessions for years. We're going to go right to a case study. In fact, let me just take you to past bio and look at this. Look at these 2 pages. So one is a control, it's non-branded. The other is lightly branded, very lightly branded. Look at the 2 side by side. Now, by the way, if you're searching for the brand on the lightly branded version, it's been blurred deliberately. But in the original run of this test, of course, it was not. So you see the control, you see the treatment, and what is the impact of brand on conversion? Everything else is identical. The answer is a 40% increase. Now, you're probably saying, of course, adding brand traded on the previous momentum in the marketplace and made a significant difference. You may be right, but before you embrace that conclusion completely, may I suggest that you look at the next test, lightly branded, fully branded. Once again, we've grayed out a little bit here, but you can see the difference. One clearly indicates the brand and what you should be connecting with regarding that brand. And what do we see in terms of conversion impact? A negative 34%, i.e. there's a decrease. So on the first version, brand enabled a gain, and on the second, it hindered a gain. So what can we learn from this? Why did that happen? I think that most of the people who attend the Marketing Experiments Clinic are interested in how can I? But beneath all the how can I's is a more important, more fundamental interrogative. Why did? Why so? Every great breakthrough in how is typically preceded with a why. The reasons that become answers to the why question power the actions that connect to the how question. All right, so keeping that in mind, let's just sort of get into some content. And to start with, I want to tell you a story. There are 2 superb leaders and well-known, I would say, celebrities in their industry. Paul particularly was the leader in a multi-billion-dollar precious metals industry and was well known for his seat on the boards and presidents of associations and many other things. And Paul was preparing to launch a new organization along with his partners and his co-founder, Lynn Stevens. And in doing so, they came to us to help them think through this connection between brand and the value proposition. Now, we've talked about brand in the past. We've talked about value proposition. We've never used one of these times to help you understand and connect with this integrated approach to both. But that was very important to these 2 entrepreneurs. They had worked with us in some research projects in the past, and so they were very, very determined to launch right, to establish the value proposition, define it, to build the business around it, and then to connect it to the brand in a way that would be forceful in the marketplace. Keeping that as a sort of background, we started developing a rich study and an analysis of the potential force of a value proposition for them. And if you've had our training in this area and you've seen all the research we've been doing for the past 20 years, you probably know that led to a critical question. I'd love to teach the significance of this question, but we've done that in other clinics and in some of our coursework, etc. The question they had to ask was this: if I am a current precious metals investor, why should I invest in precious metals with you rather than any other provider? Now that question forces the business leader to notice the if I, to transcend their current perspective, get across the equation and into the perspective or the shoes or the position of the customer, and then see the offer through the perspective of the customer. And in doing so, every word in that formulation is important. I can't break it down now except to say the answer is always a reason. In fact, you should probably take that same question and apply it to your own organization. And if the answer you give immediately doesn't or couldn't begin with the word because, it's still not right. It's the wrong form. Because may not appear on your website, that word, but the reason is actually the summation of an ultimate argument. It's the ultimate argument that justifies the existence of your enterprise. Without that argument, people are simply surviving on pockets of ignorance. If you don't have an answer, then the customer doesn't have a reason. I'm going to say that one more time. If you don't have an answer, then the customer doesn't have a reason. Because that reason is what powers them. It's what motivates them up the funnel against the organic distraction of the marketplace and eventually leads to the yes, the macro yes that converts them from prospect to customer. So obviously these entrepreneurs are very keen on getting this piece right. We did an analysis, and I want to point out for you that this is simply a sort of case study to introduce key principles that we're going to teach in a few moments. But what you're looking at is an actual excerpt from the associated research analysis, and you'll see that there's a series of reasons that were ranked through interactive dialogue and research with the principles of the enterprise and with prospects and potential customers, etc. Because you'll see that whole list. You'll see that there is a category for appeal and a category for exclusivity. Now, the problem with those two words, and you might know this if you've had our training in this area, is that they can immediately become a substitute for a much more foundational, much more philosophical, much more effective phrase that represents a conclusion. Beware, it is the role of marketing not to make a claim, but to foster a conclusion. And in this case, we want to foster a conclusion in the mind. So imagine that the conclusion in the mind of the prospect is such that they determine through appeal, I want this. And through exclusivity, I can't get this exactly this way anywhere else. So if you think about it in that way, you must understand that we asked this principal question. We formulated a series of potential answers. We ranked them in terms of the force or the strength of the appeal, that is the I want this conclusion, and the exclusivity, that is the I can't get this anywhere else conclusion. The combination of those two conclusions produce one half of a force continuum that we apply to value propositions in order to measure their effectiveness, in order to determine how much force they have, and literally to predict what sort of impact they'll have in the market. And so, having worked through that exercise and ranked them in this way, we did a further analysis. Now, what you're going to notice is that an answer is being formulated in the bottom. It is not copy for the web page or copy for the collateral or the brochure. It is essence as opposed to form. And in its essence, it's looking for the most powerful ways to express the ultimate argument to a prospect. The ultimate argue that would lead the prospect to conclude on their own that they should become a customer. We are trying to influence choice. And everything we've been doing in marketing experiments and in the science organization that powers it, MECLABS, for the last 25 years, has been focused on asking a single question. If I am the ideal prospect, well, even further, why do people say, even deeper, why do people say yes to one option over another? So you'll note with the color coding that the green sort of connects to the relentless dedication to integrity. The green is the beginning of an evidential. None of this is right yet. There's no quantitative aspect yet, but you're starting to see an answer formed around three areas. The dedication to integrity, the unparalleled market transparency, which was in the design of their very business and its site, and the fact that people are empowered to make more informed, the most informed decisions in this space. So those three reasons are tapped into in the summation below, and they connect to the reasons above. Now again, this is still in formulation. There's so much more than I can say now about it, but at least grab that method. Because you could do something even informally like this in your own organization to start working through the aspects of your value proposition and the elements that give it its potency. However, I want you to see the next iteration of the analysis and the development of the thinking. So now they're giving another answer to that tough question. If I am the ideal customer, why would I? And you can fill in the blanks. And the answer here is because customers can trust, and you'll see that there is a series of notes connected to the top statement. That 1, 2, 3 beneath that statement consists of evidentials. We're going to learn in the copywriting approach that we may teach at some other point here in Marketing Experiments how you weave the evidentials into the articulation of the value proposition and how you use it to make it instantly credible. Because if the value proposition is not clear and credible, it doesn't matter what the claim is. No one will trust it. It doesn't matter that we're trying to foster a conclusion. They're going to draw the wrong one. So bear with me now and think about this. 50 years plus experience, that's important. We can back that up with all sorts of very specific awards and positions in the industry. And you can see the rest and read it on your own. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Because really, this isn't a clinic or a class on value proposition. It's on how the value proposition can be communicated in conjunction with the brand. So, let's assume that this was a further step in the development, and that more than that, we went further, even articulating this into a copy Bible and finding ways that were both clear and credible to make these statements. Having done that, you're still left with a question: how do I integrate this with my brand? And to do that, we began to work with various, you might say, gradients of visual impact that would help us determine which one might lead to a tight connection between the message of the brand, or let's say the message of the value proposition, and the essence of the brand. Now, you'll see there are 3 categories here: the warm sort of family values, and cool mechanical precision, and fresh contemporary ease. And I would suggest for you that what you're trying to do with these images is to tap into something evocative, which leads me to point out to you that really this isn't just about science, it's about art. And sometimes, because of the emphasis at Marketing Experiments on experimentation and testing and rigor, you may come away with the conclusion that art has no place in this. But art is essential to every aspect of what we do and of what you do. Art and science come together in a unique way when marketing is done effectively. And I will tell you this: there may be 50 wrong answers to the question, how can we connect our brand to our value proposition in terms of look and feel? But there is probably more than one right answer. Maybe there's 3 or 4 ways to do this. Sometimes a leader's role is to discover that subset of the 3 precise ways or the 3 best ways, and then make a further determination with their team based on other variables. In this case, there was a selection made that was communicated in every aspect of the design and the collateral, and it closely supported the messaging of the value proposition. And this was the choice that was made. This group was located out in Oklahoma, and so rather than being in New York and the connotation that that has, they emphasized where they were located in the country and the values that some people might find connected to the sense of orientation connected to that overall location and the people that live there, the culture. And you can see that along with that, we had to determine a way to emphasize and support the value proposition with a mark and the logo. And you can see many ideas were ruled out based on a clear connection in the rationale of the message in the brand about trustworthiness and values and family, and the location and the transparency and the absolute impeccable integrity of its leaders who had been in this space for so many decades. That finally led to an understanding about what would be the best use, what font would best complement this, what color palette would best complement this, and it led to an articulation in the actual collateral. So now what you're looking at is the sort of ultimate conclusions drawn, and you start to see, if you really work through this, how everything from the colors to the font choice to the images, they're all connecting to the messaging of the value proposition. Let me warn you about something. One of the one of the knee-jerk reactions that we sometimes find ourselves tending towards in leadership is to reset the organization, and we do that reset through new branding. Very often that's like painting a building and not changing anything in the interior. You really don't get a different experience. Living on the inside is still the same experience as it was before. And I can tell you that rebranding has become an industry, and that agencies, and I'm not anti-agency, we have many agencies that are probably watching this right now, and we want to empower you. But many agencies have made money off this notion of rebranding, and we go off, and I'm not saying it's always of no value. I'm just saying that it's never enough. Rebranding is never enough, because rebranding without understanding the connection between the brand and the value proposition is a surface sort of change. And that surface change doesn't produce the overall impact that we need to achieve as leaders and within our organizations. In this case, they had the particular advantage of starting right and trying to be consistent from the beginning and thereon. And this is what was produced for them. And by the way, it's interesting how customers responded to it. And we could talk more about that, but the point is only to show you an example. Now, having done that, I want to raise a question. How do we effectively leverage our value proposition to build a brand proper from the ground up? Now you may say, well, I've got a brand and I want to understand how to apply this in that situation. This still works in those situations. But if we start at this sort of intense level, then it makes certain that all gradients in the spectrum can find application here in terms of how they're going to approach brand in their organization. So watch with me as we walk through some simple but very important principles. And I'll begin by making the first important statement. Value proposition is an argument. Brand is an impression. Now, the goal of both is to foster a conclusion. That impression connected with that argument can have a huge impact on how people position your organization in their mind. And the value proposition experience creates an impression, and brand leverages the impression to create buying momentum. Brand itself is the aggregate experience of the value proposition in the marketplace. Now, that's not a common definition, but it is a highly technical definition developed from lots of research here inside of Marketing Experiments in MECLABS. And what we've discovered is that the experience of the value proposition in the marketplace, even if I haven't personally experienced it, but my friend has, and I read about it in the media, or I see it in the media, all of those touch points impact my general impression. I'll give you an example. Before you bought your first iWatch or your first tablet, you already had an impression of Apple, and that impression was carefully cultivated by that organization. And the aggregate experience of the value proposition was transformative. Apple did not change and become one of the, well, perhaps the greatest retailer in the world, and the metrics are stunning on what Apple's achieved in the past. It did not achieve that because it did a rebrand. It didn't achieve it because Steve just came back and provided leadership. It did not change because they raised enough capital to overcome their challenges. When Steve stepped in, they were, some say, 4 months away from closing the doors. Steve immediately eliminated product line after product line so that he could focus on delivering a product that had resonance and impact and that helped customers in a transcendent way. And when he introduced the iPod, the world didn't suddenly embrace it, or Apple. But the experience of 1,000 songs in your pocket was transformative. Changed the whole industry of music. Changed many things. And then it was followed up by yet another product that people enjoyed, that was different, that was produced by someone who thinks different. And we responded to that. It's so popular, its impact is so powerful that today, now this may not be true in 5 years, but today, if Apple released an iChicken, many of us would stand in line to get it. Why? Because whatever they released, we didn't know we wanted tablets until they showed us that we wanted tablets. We've come to trust the fact that there's a special experience around Apple products. This is the power of brand. The good news is it's hard to measure on a balance sheet the true impact, the true positive force of brand. The bad news is it can evaporate overnight. If you pay attention to your brand but you're not paying attention to your value proposition, you're already headed to trouble. So think about that for a moment as I'll talk about the next steps. Brands can attempt to create an impression that occurs before and even after the purchase. Because you may not actually own that iPod. You may not actually own that device or whatever that service is. You may not have experienced it, but you already have an impression about it from conversations you've had, from the experience you've had in the media, and all those other ways that data comes into our mind. And that impression may be positive enough to move you to make a purchase decision. But if there is not alignment between the promise and the experience of the value proposition, that impression is not just nullified, it has an intense negative reaction. You have a negative ricochet, an inverted impact that really can hurt you. So you must pay close attention between the brand itself, the impression you're striving to create, and the alignment of that impression with the experience. So thinking about that together, let's look at this for just a moment. So in this case, we have an argument on the left, and then as you view it, and an impression on the right, and the combination of the impression and the argument help to place someone in a certain position or get their mind to place the organization in a certain position. Brand is always owned, by the way, not by the company. That's a misnomer. It's a dangerous falsehood. Brand is owned in the mind of the customer. All you can do is attempt to influence that, but you have no power over that real estate in their mind. You can work to improve your position, but they can take it from you in a split second. Witness what happened to Enron. Many people heard about how deadly the largest bankruptcy in history at that point, Enron. These are not on my notes, but think about something. I don't know if many of you went back, but because I did. I read the way people raved, analysts and investors and business leaders, about how innovative and how forward-thinking and how smart the Enron organization was. In one night, that disappeared. And the name became almost synonymous to profanity as investors were wiped out right and left and people everywhere suffered. Employees were laid off and all the pain and suffering that goes with it. If you don't get your value proposition right, it doesn't matter what your brand is. You got to get them both aligned and in a powerful way. So here's another point. The most effective brands leverage that impression to foster a conclusion. But that conclusion can somehow, some way transcend the company's value. It can actually connect to the prospect's identity. This is where brand becomes more potent. This is where brand intensifies its force to move an individual to action. And you can see it when you think about this now famous campaign. I remember when it was launched. Many of you probably that are listening to this teaching or participating now live can remember also. But one of the brilliant moves made by Apple and their agency was this simple connection. They made those innovative people who think different and impact the world synonymous with what it means to be Apple. And more importantly, they implied for what it means to use the Apple product. And this campaign was highly effective. And think for a moment how image focused it is. This isn't just about, look what Muhammad Ali does. This is seducing you to see yourself as one of those people who thinks different. This is touching your aspirations connected to your identity. And because of that, it's particularly powerful. I could say the same thing about this now legendary campaign. What I say next may not be popular, but I'm going to say it anyway. Cigarettes are obviously harmful to our health, and I doubt most people are born with an instant urge to smoke a cigarette. It is think about it. You've got to get all of the preconceived notions that are in our mind away and just think. This little round tube packed with something that can damage your lungs and kill you. We know that to be a scientific fact. If you were the first person in the world to create one of these, how would you seduce the world to start smoking them? If you really could divorce yourself from all the preconceived notions and ask, how did a generation embrace cigarettes so powerfully and so unanimously? One of the most successful campaigns in the history of advertising was the Marlboro Man. And I want you to notice these various versions of this image, and there were many, many others, show you this rugged. Now by the way, they had movie stars that they made contracts with who smoked a particular brand so that you could attach to their image too. But let's just focus on Marlboro. The implication here is that rugged, strong men. And I'm using, this is 70s and 60s language, and I don't mean to be offensive to anyone, but that rugged, strong men, smoke the Marlboro brand. Beer commercials have done the same thing for years. Now, I'm looking at this, and I'm suggesting to you that if you can step away from your preconceptions, there's a lot to be learned from what happened here, because it was undeniably effective. And they were using a technique, and I want to take that technique and clearly think about how you can use it in a powerful and positive way to help people. So here's a question. How can I leverage my brand to impact the prospect's identity? And as you think about that, I want to introduce a technique. This technique was developed inside of our research program here, and I've never taught it except in the classroom and in the program that we're doing at the University of Florida. I want you to take a moment and think about something you may recall from school, the syllogism. Aristotle, the great thinker of old, talked about syllogisms and began to lay out principles of logic. And I'll remind you a bit about that. A classic syllogism has a simple and common structure. There's P1, P2, and 3P. All, and then there's a term, and then there's a predicate. And then there's a subject, this is P2, and the subject is identified with a middle term. And then you're listening to me and thinking, I still don't get this. It's okay, you're going to get it in 2 minutes. Bear with me. From those 2 points, P1 and P2, those 2 propositions, we're able to draw a conclusion. You probably know that my training is in philosophy, and we spent a lot of time on syllogisms. And part of what we did in our research here was ask, what structure can we adopt that will help us communicate a powerful way to leverage the value proposition as a conclusion or as a foster or a reason that drives a conclusion, that reason with the impression of the brand, and then take the 2 and connect them to identity. And here's what you're going to see. So here's a classic syllogism. If you're not familiar with what you're seeing on the left, you'll certainly see what's on the right and how it makes sense. All, and the middle term is men, but all men are mortal. There's your predicate. Socrates is a man. Now just think about that for just a moment. Does that clearly indicate what the conclusion is right? Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now if you've had training in logic, you know there's a difference between a true conclusion and a valid conclusion. I'm not going to get into that right now. What I want to do is tell you that there's a powerful way you can leverage this. And you may be saying, I don't do philosophy and I don't understand. Stay with me till you see an example. And it might help you realize a new way to approach some of your thinking in your brand and your marketing. So, this is an example, by the way, of what happened in the development of that campaign and how Apple arrived at its syllogism. Apple didn't, to my knowledge, use these words, but it's what they did. They sort of developed and advertised a particular syllogism and tried to impress our minds with it. And there's a story. You can read about the story of how the Think Different campaign was developed, but it was influenced by this particular illustration. This is from Craig, who developed the essence of the campaign. And the idea to him of something being more than it was inspired him to doodle an Apple computer and label it, "This is not a box." This is the beginning of this conclusion, think different. This is not a box led him to sort of play with what you see in the next illustration. His thoughts shifted to Dr. Seuss and how so many of the characters are unique or social outcasts. And next to one of the doodles he did on paper, as he was sort of stimulating his creativity, was this phrase, think different. Jobs loved that phrase. Think different, as he said, celebrates the soul of the Apple brand. That creative people with passion can change the world for the better. This isn't just rhetoric. It's not rhetoric in the sense that people bought it. People felt something different about Apple, and they embraced it. Now, let's go back and look at how that might be framed in a syllogism. And it's a virtual syllogism. Any of you who is an expert in logic can easily challenge what I'm going to show you right now. But this is very functional. It's very useful when you understand it in terms of branding. All people who use Apple products think differently. I use Apple products, therefore I think differently. Now let's take that in a different direction. That desired conclusion about my identity can foster me to use the Apple product so that I can be part of that set of people who think differently. There's more than one way to structure this, but what you must understand is that the conclusion draws me into a desire to be one who uses and known as one who uses the Apple product. That's the identity connection to this impression that Apple was making. And you can use this same sort of impression in a unique way to power your own thinking. And in each of these, looking at, again, back to Marlboro. Marlboro didn't begin marketing to men until the 50s. And there's a reason for that, having to do with filters. You can read it on the screen. But at that point, TV cowboys were a big draw, and they were very influential, and they were very popular. And Marlboro focused on appealing to that type of person. And they went for an archetype. And by focusing your branding on the core of an archetype, you can also reach the peripheral versions of that in terms of its gradient spectrum. And Apple did the same thing. Or actually, Apple did the same thing, and of course Marlboro did. So let's look at a syllogism from the Marlboro standpoint. All people who smoke Marlboro are rugged, tough, and manly. And I think we're using the word people carefully. There was no concern about sexism at this point. This was all about men, and they focused it that way. I smoke Marlboro. Therefore, I am rugged, tough, and manly. Now, we know that's ridiculous. But you must remember something about impressions. Impressions don't follow the same rules as conclusions and logic. Impressions sometimes are made in spite of our best effort to deflect them. And it occurred in a way in the market and with a frequency that was high impact. I read a study years ago in my research that said Madison Avenue, where advertising is sort of famous in terms of its base, did a research project, and it takes a commercial. I don't know if this study is accurate, just to be clear to everyone. I don't have it. I'm recalling it from memory, and it's been 20 years. But I do remember its conclusion. It takes the average commercial 16 times before it penetrates the critical sensor that defends new thinking from your subconscious mind. Many of you know that there's a conscious and a subconscious mind. Now that's a rough statement, and there's in terms of neurology and the debates that are out there today, but the bottom line is these deeper beliefs are protected by a critical sensor, and there's a couple of ways to get past them. A hypnotist puts the critical sensor to sleep. An advertiser wears it down with repetition. That's why children who grow up hearing negative statements about their intelligence from a parent sometimes come away unable to believe in themselves or unable to shake the sense that they feel either stupid or ugly. There is power in repetition, and I'm not suggesting anything negative with this whole sort of session on branding, but I am inviting you to think about how syllogism and identity can connect to brand, and how you can take impression and you can take reason and help people draw an emphatic conclusion. And that powers everything we understand about brand. So Heartland did it like this. All investors who use Heartland value family, integrity, and caring for the future of others. I'm an investor who uses Heartland. Therefore, I value family, integrity, and caring for the future of others. And again, some people reaching for the third term or the conclusion embrace the middle term, or P2, the middle proposition. So, if we were to take everything we've said today and put it in 4 clear statements that you could take away and reflect on as you go back to the workplace, here they are. And I know that today's been different. So if you're on this right now to the program, can I invite you to use your Q&A to speak to us? And let me know if you're finding this helpful and useful. And let me know what we could send to you or how we can help you if you attended this event to improve your understanding or to make it more effective. I'm flanked here by staff and support people wanting to do everything we can to help any of you that have joined this audience to gather something of value today. And I appreciate all of you coming to the Marketing Experiments Help. I'm seeing your feedback coming in. Thank you, Chip. And all that feedback helps us continue to do the research and improve what we're doing. So thank you for attending. I look forward to another Marketing Experiments Clinic, and I deeply appreciate the feedback. If you enjoyed the day, tell a friend, and let's keep growing our community of evidence-based marketers.